Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us here on YouTube Live. We are talking all things Kubernetes this week. So as usual, we're taking questions from you in chat, and I have a special guest. But before we get to all that and answer your questions and talk about Kubernetes, I want to deal with some logistic stuff on this channel. If you're new and this is your first time checking out this video, we are indeed live. If you are seeing the chat scroll and you see the little live notification on YouTube, it's not really recorded unless you're watching this way later. So this is Thursday afternoon in the US, and we're going to be here every week live. I've been doing this now 6 or 8 months, I think. On Thursdays, we talk to everyone in the community that basically wants to talk about DevOps. And this is mostly for my students in my courses, which I will briefly mention. You can check out my courses at the URL here, brettfisher.com/docker. We just released the new Node.js course, so you can get that and a special coupon to get it for the low price of $10 over at brettfisher.com/node. And that course is somewhere around 8 or 9 hours of the best way to use Node.js in containers. It goes through all the best practices for Docker, how to deploy it on orchestration, and recently, I even, like days after we launched it, I updated it with an ARM section to talk about how you can develop with Node.js for IoT and embedded devices using Docker on your Mac or Windows machine. So go check that stuff out. That's the stuff that I do all day. This is for fun, so I hope you're ready for an entertaining hour of questions. And enough with that. If you haven't asked your questions, get them in the chat because we try to go in order from the top down and answer the questions. We've already got a huge stack piled up. If we don't get to your questions, stick around in chat after the show. We will hang out in chat for a while to answer any questions at the end that we don't get to during this hour of live YouTube. So if you can't get those questions answered there, just keep your browser open and we'll reply to you in chat. All right. Let's bring in Jérôme Petazzoni. We've known each other for years, but Jérôme was a Docker captain, number 0, and worked at Docker for 7 years, even before it was actually called Docker. He now is working as an independent trainer, and he can teach Kubernetes, where he does teach Kubernetes, as well as a little bit of Docker, I'm told. And he's calling in from Cleveland at the moment, where he's attending the PyCon conference for Python, if you're not aware of that conference. His home base is in Topeka, Kansas, near to where I grew up in Missouri. But he also can be found in various other locations in the US as well as in Europe to deliver talks and training sessions here and there. Welcome to the show, Jérôme. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi.
So, all right, you are actively, this is perfect because having you on the show and talking about Kubernetes while you're at a show talking about Kubernetes, right? You just finished up PyConf. Tell us a little bit about that show, for people that aren't aware of what that is. And
Sure. Well, the PyCon conference is it's a conference that's very dear to my heart in the sense that it's a community-run conference, but it has everything that bigger commercial conferences has, and even more. Like, for instance, even though the conference, as you might think about it, ended on Sunday, so last week, now since the beginning of this week, like since Monday up to today, there are the sprints going on. The sprints are where a bunch of people can gather in, still on the conference venue. There are a bunch of rooms available, something between 10 and 20 rooms. And all these folks who usually work together online over GitHub issues, etc., can now work together in person. It's a little bit like a huge open source co-working space, made available by the conference organizers for the community. And that's just one of the many little things that make PyCon really interesting. Just another really amazing little feat is that the videos for the talks of that conference are mostly already online. I have memories of PyCon a few years ago where I missed the keynote, but I saw some tweets that made me think that it was a really important keynote that I really wanted to see. And I think later during that day or the day after, I was able to check on the recording and catch up and have conversations about that keynote with other folks at the conference. So yeah, really great show. If you are in the Python community, I definitely recommend that you check it out because it's really worth it.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've been going for years, right?
Yeah, my first PyCon was, I think, maybe 2012. That I was doing a talk on zero RPC, the internal RPC thing we were using at Docker at .cloud back then, because it was before the Docker days.
Right.
There is a recording of that available where you can see how my accent improved over the last few years, because my accent back then was pretty thick and horrible. It's still thick, but hopefully less horrible. And yeah, that was my first PyCon. But since then, I went back a bunch of times. I think I try to make it a thing every year, except if I just can't do it. But it's that important of a conference to me.
Yeah, and I haven't been, unfortunately, and it's sad because I hear so many good things out of it each year, and I've watched plenty of videos from that conference. So it definitely makes me wish that it was that I could attend all conferences. Right? I think that's one of the challenges in this industry. It's like no matter where you are, especially if you live outside the U.S. or Western Europe. I don't know all the conferences around the entire world, but it definitely seems like that. Those are the focus areas for a lot of the tech conferences, and it's sad that we can't have more conferences in more places so people can go. Because I think there's a lot of places in the world where it's more than a few hours drive to get to a conference, and unless you're speaking, it's often hard to get there and pay for it unless your company gets you there. So, but I think I keep hearing about that conference as just a general conference. Like things happen at that conference, right? That was when Docker was announced, was at that conference, right?
True, yeah. 2013 during the lightning talks. And on a personal level, I also remember I think the first talks on mental health in the tech industry that I ever saw were also at the PyCon conference, maybe 2014 Montreal, when I say 2014 or 2015. And I even had some really on a personal level, really important conversations there with other folks in what we call the hallway track, when you just have this kind of serendipitous kind of impromptu meeting and you start talking about real stuff. And that I feel like I've had these moments at PyCon more than at any other conference. So that's also why it has a special place to me.
Yeah, it's not an accident. I think it's a deliberate effort. And having been involved with the organization of conferences, that stuff doesn't happen by accident. That's a lot of hard work over years of being persistent and just focusing on the community and less on the technical content, although that's always important. But there
is also a big thing on the technical content, but it's the idea that we're not going to only have the super deep hardcore technical talks, because we recognize that the community is not just a bunch of people who want this hardcore technical content. There are also newcomers. There are also people who've been around for a while but want to look at things with a different perspective, etc., etc. It's I really kind of, when I was involved in the organization of DockerCon, for instance, for Docker, I was always kind of looking at things at PyCon as setting a kind of example on some aspects, especially about diversity and inclusion, and having a really encompassing program, etc., etc.
Yeah, there's definitely more than a few of those people coming out of that conference that, like yourself, that I keep hearing the same things from, and that's something that where I feel like I need to go, even though I'm not necessarily a Python developer every day. I feel like I need to go just to experience the community, and it'll probably suck me in, and then I'll be like a Python fanboy. Well, cool. So that's why you're there in Cleveland. We're getting questions in chat about the entry fee for PyCon. So we probably don't have all that information because that'll be for next year. So what do we know the website PyCon?
It's us.pycon.org, and I think that I can say is that they have a really big financial aid program. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but it's really a pretty huge budget that they put into making sure that underrepresented folks and not only underrepresented folks, but even like if you are an independent developer, and or even if you're employed but your employer won't send you to the conference, basically anyone who's not sponsored by their employer is eligible for financial aid at PyCon. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So I've seen many people who were at PyCon thanks to that program. So.
Yeah, that's very cool. I know DockerCon does the same thing, and I also, in case you're on the East Coast U.S., I'm also going to be doing a Swarm and Kubernetes workshop all in one in about 3 weeks here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, at Revolution Conf. So I just want to mention that. Just search Virginia Beach Revolution Conf. It's something we do here in the community every year. It's about 350 people. It's really cheap, but they also have sort of scholarships where you can get not only a free conference fee, but also potentially travel costs reimbursed if you're someone who your company doesn't pay, and you're in a situation, maybe you're a student or something like that. So it's a pretty cool organization, and it's really just like 5 or 6 people that really just volunteer their time around the year to help make something happen like this. So it's always great when it's community conferences. Cool. All right. So enough about the conferences. Let's talk about Kubernetes, which is the big tagline I put on YouTube. So everybody's probably here to talk about Kubernetes. So you, we go back long enough, right? It seems like your career at Docker was first talking about Docker, and then everybody started to get into orchestration. And Swarm and Kubernetes kind of came around the same time, within a year or so of each other. And so then at first we were talking about Swarm. And then now it seems like these last 2 or 3 years, you've talked almost exclusively on Kubernetes. Tell me a little bit about that journey. Like, what was that like to have to go from just learning Docker all the way to Kubernetes?
Sure. If I only start from the moment when I started talking about orchestration, I think the first orchestration workshop, like the first time I was in front of people trying to teach orchestration, was June 2015. And I remember that did pretty well, because that's when I wrote the demo app Docker Coins they kept using all the way through. And I found that pretty fun, because I've taken that app on Docker clusters before Swarm, then on the first Swarm, and then the new Swarm with Swarm mode, and then now on Kubernetes. So it was really interesting to see the steps to take that very same code, which, by the way, didn't change by a single line since then, through these different environments. To me, it was a really interesting journey, because at first it was really like, okay, we have Docker, which is an amazing toolbox of things, and we have to put that together to deploy a distributed application. Then Swarm made that so much easier. They were like, I felt like I had a bunch of extra little tools on the side, like, hey, this is my load balancing hack and toolbox. This is my service discovery thing. And the more, as time passed, and as Swarm had more features, I could get rid of a bunch of these components, until we reached the point where I think it was for DevOps Days Minneapolis in 2017, I was able in 90 minutes, so 1.5 hours, to demonstrate how to set up a Swarm cluster and then deploy this read application on that cluster, really like from A to Z, without using much external tools or hacks or scripts or etc. And I found that was a pretty powerful demo of what you can learn and what you can do in a really short time. And then I think in a few months after that was when Docker did the announcement, like, hey, now we're going to support both Swarm and Kubernetes, and you get to pick and choose what's best for you. That's when I started to deliver workshops on Kubernetes. And at first, I'm not going to lie, at first I was a little bit afraid that this would be complicated and a whole bunch of new things to learn. And I found that it was, with what I knew, it was pretty straightforward. A little bit as if, since I had learned Swarm first, I just had to map these concepts. And I
Yeah.
totally acknowledge that if you're getting started with Kubernetes, it can be a lot of like a new vocabulary, a new way of doing things. There are pods and there are deployments and replica sets and a bunch of controllers and what's even that. And it's a lot of extra information and it's a big like overload. But since I already had experience with Swarm, at least the key concepts, declarative modes and reconciliation loops and all these little things, like, okay, I know that. So then I just had to learn how it maps to Kubernetes. A bit, like we say that if you know how to learn French or Italian, it's easier to learn the other way, the other one, that kind of things. Some languages are pretty close one to another, and I felt a little bit that way. I was like, okay, I know Swarm, and so it feels very straightforward once you know Swarm to dive into Kubernetes. So for me, it's a journey that was not easy, but I felt like I was lucky enough to have all these steps and be able to climb the steps one by one instead of being like, oh, okay, how am I ever gonna get up there?
Yeah.
So that's how it felt. And even now, when I tackle more advanced things on Kubernetes, like operators and how do I manage my own clusters and like the cluster federation, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I feel like I was lucky to again this step like one by one. So when I have a new concept, instead of being like, oh my god, this is overwhelming, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to add a few building blocks on top of this thing I already know, and it feels easier to grasp and to understand. So that's how I feel about all that.
Yeah, and I imagine that when we all teach, I think a lot of times we teach the way we think, the way we learn, right? Like, and so it's always challenging to provide education in that everyone can use. And I have to imagine that you learning the way you did, instead of coming from a cold start where things were nothing. It's not like you didn't have any background in Docker when you started Kubernetes. And I think that's one of sort of the ways that people can get exhausted with Kubernetes and just almost quit sometimes when they're doing initial learning, is it's like they try to go too fast too soon. And so the way you learn and the way you teach is actually the way that I recommend for others, because I feel like it's giving them little pieces and success at each stage, right? Like learning the Docker success stuff there. Because if you don't, it's like if you have all theory and no application, I feel like it's really hard to understand these concepts. But if you can figure out Docker and then figure out Compose and then figure out Swarm and then figure out Kubernetes, I do feel like it's a very layered approach to getting to probably the most complicated thing we've invented so far in tech is a hand-built Kubernetes cluster running containers in a distributed environment like that. There's not a whole lot of other tech out there that's as complicated as that if you're doing it yourself, right? At least for most people.
Yeah.
So it's like that's sort of the question we get a lot in the classes is like, hey, what should I learn first?
Right. I don't know if I would say it's the most complicated thing. However, I feel like it's one thing where there is a huge difference between doing it yourself and using some managed or prepackaged solution. Even though, like, arguably, it's a little bit like building your own Linux kernel. It's a thing that if you're on Linux, at some point you might run into like, hey, you must build your own kernel because you need this patch to support your brand new like Wi-Fi interface because you picked that super new shiny laptop, but unfortunately it's not super well supported yet. So it's kind of little thing where there's a huge gap between the experience you have when you just like pop Ubuntu or another distro in a machine and boom, it works and you set it up and you're done, compared to, hey, I'm doing everything by hand. And at the end, if you look at the results, there is no clear difference. You just, in both cases, you end up with a Linux machine and it works, and you're like browsing the web or coding or do whatever things you want to do, and you're like, why do I need to jump through all these hoops? And the answer is, well, because you have this fancy new shiny laptop with this special Wi-Fi interface, which is not super well supported yet. And so for Kubernetes, I feel that there is a parallel here. where you could just get a managed cluster from all the managed offerings out there. I'm not even going to list them since now there are so many. And in a matter of minutes, you get your cluster up and running, and it works and it's great. Or you could also build it yourself. And the first time you're going to do that, that's probably take you days or even weeks as you learn all the components and all the concepts. And at the end, you still get a Kubernetes cluster. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that sometimes if you work for, I don't know, like some really high stakes financial or military, or if you are a nation state that doesn't have their own nation cloud, like, okay, maybe I need to be building and running my own Kubernetes clusters for good reasons. But at the end, you still get a cluster. And yeah, there is that huge gap, which on the one hand makes people think like, oh, this is really complicated. And on the other, when I say it's not that complicated, it is complicated if you want to learn everything inside out, because yes, it's a really complicated system. But if you want to stick to the things that you need to know to deploy actual applications, then it's fine. The same way that, I mean, a lot of us know how to drive a car around, not too dangerously, hopefully. However, not many of us would know how to actually build a car from scratch. It's like, hey, here's a bunch of steel and plastics and whatever, and now you just build yourself a car. It's like, yeah, good luck. Very few people would actually be able to do that without a lot of very extensive training and tools and etc. So same thing.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that. A lot of us are going to be using Kubernetes, but we're not going to be building necessarily Kubernetes from scratch, right? Do you call these? I've been calling them distributions. Do you call it that? Do you have anyone call it distributions of Kubernetes?
Sometimes, yeah. I think it's a pretty accurate name, especially if it's something that you're going to install on your own clusters. Like if you look at Kubespray or Tarmac or something like that, like or Tectonic. It's really like, okay, this is a thing that's been made to go on a bunch of machines. But if we look at the managed Kubernetes offerings of a cloud provider, do I want to call that a distribution? Maybe, but it's a little bit more confusing of a word in that case.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so almost like, I guess I could make up a term and call it cloud distributions of Kubernetes. Yeah, because I mean, I think that's a lot of other Docker captains have echoed the advice that if you look like you're going to be the person who's going to be responsible for orchestration in your organization, and you want to pick Kubernetes, if you're the only person, you probably don't want to hand build it yourself, like you're following Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way. You probably want to use at minimum a tool to deploy it and manage all the security and the things that can basically, if you mess up, either prevent high availability and fault tolerance, or possibly open you up to security risks. And because there have been sort of big publicized situations where Kubernetes clusters were not properly locked down and people were able to get in over the internet. So you obviously don't want any of that. So I think the easier way to avoid all that is to pick, if you're even just one person, maybe even one of these distributions that does almost all of it for you, like maybe Rancher or Docker Enterprise, or I'm not sure if there's other ones, Tectonic. I don't know if I think that's getting rolled in or something to
in OpenShift, yeah.
Yeah, so or OpenShift. Well, of course, I have never deployed OpenShift, so I don't actually know how easy that is. I just know that people that with Rancher and Docker Enterprise, they talk about it, being a couple of lines per server essentially to install it. So it's not really in order to have. And in my opinion, like when we're talking about Kubernetes, there's two types of setups really in my mind. There's what we all use on our local machine to learn and play, right? And that's probably you're using Docker Desktop maybe if you're on Mac or Windows, and that it's a click of a button in the settings that opens it up for you. What would you recommend for people that are learning Kubernetes and if they're not using Docker Desktop? What's the next best thing? Is it still Minikube?
Minikube is also like the kind of the both legacy thing, but in a positive way. Like it's been around for a long time, so there's extensive support for it. It works great. I've heard excellent things about Micro Key 8S, which is something on Ubuntu which lets you get a local Kubernetes cluster like really quickly on modern Ubuntu distributions. And
You said that was
then
micro K8s?
yeah,
Yeah, okay.
and then personally, another approach I do is that if I mean, locally, I end up still working mostly with Docker Compose. And then when I need to go in an actual cluster, I need like a real cluster. I need multiple nodes and I need to, like see how things are really going to behave on the cluster. So what I've done is that I've um, written and refined a few scripts that let me start a cluster really quickly, and then in a few minutes I get my cluster, I can work on it, and when I'm done I trash it down. And if I need a cluster for a few hours or for a day, that's gonna cost me maybe a few bucks, which is cheaper than a coffee at your favorite coffee joint, I'm going to assume.
Probably.
And that gives me like the real experience, so to speak. So in my specific case, I'm jumping directly from local Docker Compose to an actual cluster on a cloud platform. Now, for many folks, yeah, maybe like if you're on Linux, check out Minikube. If you're on Mac or Windows, then Docker Desktop. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And there's also Play with Kubernetes, right?
Right.
Run by one of the other Docker captains. I think it's play with Kubernetes, or K8s maybe is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Play with
Yep.
K8s.
That's a really good option to tinker a little bit and show a quick demo. I think it. Yeah, the limitation of like 4 hours means that for my specific use case,
Right.
okay, if I want to limit myself to 4 hours, I might as well get a real cluster, and that for 4 hours, it's gonna cost me like less than a buck for a 3, 4, 5 nodes cluster. But yeah, once in a while, I mean, when I was at Docker and I had to show things on Swarm, for instance, I would use Play with Docker a lot, because in literally 1 minute, I would get a brand new cluster up and running and set up. And so for quick live demos, like, it's impossible to beat that. For Kubernetes, I'm using it a little bit less because maybe it takes a few more steps to get all the clusters set up properly. But that's also a really solid option. Yeah.
Right. Let's see here. I'm looking through the questions. All right, so we have tons of questions. We have lots of conversation going on, which is great. So I don't want to, avoid. I don't think we're gonna be able to get through all these questions. Narahari has asked like 30 questions, so we may not get through all of those. What is Kubernetes? I think we've defined that at least a little bit. Simply, Kubernetes is one way to solve the problem of I have lots of containers and I want to run them across many servers. And when
Yep.
so I think when both of us, first off, I should say a lot of what I learned about workshopping on Docker and stuff, I learned from Jérôme. So like I remember there was like a year 2016, I think it was, in Seattle. I was taking Jérôme's Swarm workshop. So he is sort of the master. I'm the Padawan here. But the situation with orchestration, or let's say the definition, I think, of orchestration in the sense that we're talking about with containers, is the simplest definition I've ever come up with. Is it's essentially taking a set of servers and letting them act like one, so that you can type one command line and a whole bunch of servers work together and make decisions for you to run containers. And Kubernetes is I think everyone's in agreement, the most popular choice to do that. It is also the most feature rich, but it's also known as being the one that's the hardest to get started with, or at least to set up initially and manage. And it may not be necessarily the hardest thing to use, but it can be a little tough at the beginning to get it all set up and working and understand all the parts. That's why I think a lot of us sometimes recommend just learn Docker, because that'll teach you containers, right? So you can take my Docker Mastery course, dockermastery.com. And then, when you get to orchestration, there's a question in here later on. I'm sorry, I didn't see who's posted that, but I saw a question where someone said, what should I learn first? Should I learn Kubernetes or Swarm or OpenShift? And my answer might be it's based on your timing, Because if your company is like expecting you to know this stuff as soon as humanly possible because they've got some ridiculous deadline, and you know your company is going to go OpenShift, well, as long as you learn Docker, like now you're going to need to learn OpenShift. You probably shouldn't spend all your time learning other orchestrators if you already know that's the one you have to know for your job. So job first, right? We all want to be employed and be good at our jobs. But if you have the time, and this is just more of you're preparing for your future, and a lot of my students say they're getting into DevOps, so they want to learn these topics to know them. I think both of us are recommending Swarm initially because both of us can deliver a Swarm workshop in a half a day to a full day, right? You can learn most of Swarm in a full day workshop. All of the extra features, how to set it up, tear it down, how to deploy, multi-node distributed apps on it, how to do monitoring and logging, all those things can be done pretty easily in a day. Then, once you've learned those basic concepts, if you desire to learn, the most popular one, Kubernetes, then you might want to jump to that. You could skip Swarm, but I feel like since it's built into every Docker, and a lot of people, if your company doesn't have a hard requirement for a particular orchestrator, a lot of people find that if they're just setting up a few servers and it's just one person and they don't need all the feature set and complexity of Kubernetes, they can get by with Swarm since it comes with Docker out of the box. And a lot of people are very happy with that. In fact, Jérôme and I, before the call, were talking about at DockerCon last week. There was a Swarm Kit open source session, and Swarm Kit is the library that makes Swarm possible. And just like every Kubernetes room, the Swarm Kit room was full of people, and they were all interested in the future of Swarm. We were learning that we were getting jobs eventually, hopefully this year, job support. We were getting CSI storage support for Kubernetes storage features and stuff like that. And then a couple of other things I think they were adding in on top of that. They had 3 or 4 other features that they were listing as new things. So you can choose whichever one you want to choose, but I think eventually for us DevOps focused people, you probably should know 2 of everything. Like in general, if you know one scripting language, you might want to just play around with a second one so that you can compare. If you know one cloud, maybe try another cloud for a little bit to see the differences, because I think for all of us, if you know one thing to solve a problem, it's that whole analogy of a hammer. When you only have a hammer, everything, or was it?
Yeah, everything looks like a nail when all you have is a hammer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when you only have one tool in your toolbox, you're going to try to solve every problem with that. And you might find that, in your case, your company is going to buy a Kubernetes distribution, I guess if we're going to call it that, a Kubernetes product, from Docker or another company that sells those. And so you want to learn that first, but you might want to just on the side learn a little bit about Swarm in case you don't always need Kubernetes. Like Swarm is really great on IoT. It runs on Raspberry Pis. Not to get too off topic, but Jérôme, have you played it all with the K3S? Not related to K3OS?
I've read about it and looked a little bit in the architecture, etc., but I haven't played with it yet. Yeah,
me neither. It's for those of you that aren't familiar, it's a variant of Kubernetes that throws out a lot of the features that not everybody needs in Kubernetes essentially, and tries to really trim it down to a simple, easier solution. And is it Darren? I'm trying to remember
Darren Shepherd, I think.
Darren Shepherd, yeah. And I think he was at DockerCon. I missed the session, and someone told me later that he did a session on K3OS. I think I'm saying that right. And I think he quoted on stage as they were trying to make Kubernetes act like as simple as Swarm. So it's like we're all influenced in using ideas from other products and tools and stuff to make our tools. So on that, if there's a pendulum, and on one side is ease of use, ease of deployment, and on the other side is all the features, all the things. It's like Kubernetes started over here, Swarm started over here, and they're kind of doing this. Like Kubernetes is getting easier to deploy and manage. Swarm's getting more features, and I think it was actually Docker founder. I'm spacing on his name.
Solomon,
yeah. Sorry, the one of the founders of Docker, Solomon Hykes, actually said somewhere at a DockerCon years ago, and I remember him saying it, that he thinks eventually all orchestrators are going to have almost all the, like they're going to roughly have all the same features. They're all going to be very similar, and the conclusion is like the features that nobody uses will all go away, and the features everybody wants will all be in the ones that are still supported. And so whether or not we have three orchestrators or 10, eventually they'll all look very similar, and maybe that's so. All right, moving to the questions. I think we answered a lot of these already, Nirahari. What is it helping with? We talked about orchestration and what that's about. Kube predates Swarm or the other way? Do you remember, Jérôme? I think they were kind of both released in the same year.
That's a good question. I don't have the exact timeline, and it depends once you account for the first version of Swarm or
Swarm Classic
and the Swarm mode. Swarm mode was definitely later, and was a kind of way to catch up with Kubernetes. But then at the same time, you could argue that there are many features in modern Kubernetes that make it useful, etc., and that were not necessarily there in the beginning.
Roughly in terms of the lifetime of IT, roughly the same time. I think both Swarm Classic and Kubernetes were 2014, and then Swarm Mode was 2016. But that was also like Kubernetes 1.0 release wasn't in 2014. It was sort of a beta to begin with. Anyway, it's all within the span of the last 5 years, right? But that doesn't have anything, like you were saying, that doesn't have anything to do with their maturity or feature set or which one you should use, because if you look at like the PRs and the pace of Kubernetes changing, it's way faster than Swarm. Swarm, I almost look at it as like, maybe it's a horrible analogy, but like Android and Apple phones, right? Android tends to have things first, and they experiment a lot more, and I feel like Apple just takes only the best parts or the things that are most popular and then adds them in, and that's. So you might say that the things in Apple or the 80-20 rule. It's probably a horrible analogy, but I feel like that's kind of how Swarm compares to Kubernetes. It's like, only the things that are very popular and everyone really likes about Kubernetes even potentially get added to Swarm, like jobs. We've been talking about jobs for Swarm for years, and the Swarm Kit team has definitely heard us, and they've known about our request for like a year and a half now. That we feel like jobs should be the next feature that they add, the next major feature, and so they're working on that this year. In fact, there's actually a PR out there from Drew, one of the core developers, that I didn't bring up. But if you have feedback on how jobs should work in an orchestrator, if you just go to the Swarm Kit repo on GitHub and go in the PR section, there will be a big thing there about looking for feedback on how jobs should work. And basically, they're taking the best jobs functionality out of Kubernetes and trying to add it to Swarm without adding all of the bells and whistles that Kubernetes usually has. So anyway, can I run on my local, aka single node Swarm equivalent? Yes. So I think we answered that. If you're running Docker Desktop, that's already built in. You just go into settings and check the box. If you're not running Docker Desktop, if you're maybe running Docker Toolbox or Linux, then you would use something like Minikube, or what was the other one?
Micro K8s.
Micro K8s. Is Micro trying to claim that it's smaller than Mini? Isn't that
maybe
Mini and Micro? I always forget.
Maybe.
Yeah. Which language is it written in? Well, I believe all of these tools are written in Go. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Docker's Go, Swarm is Go, Kubernetes is Go language. If you're searching the internet, you might type Golang for that. Why the hype?
Why the hype? Well, from my perspective, is because there was a hype on containers, because suddenly, okay, we have a way to package things and run them in a way that that's much easier than before. So we can debate on that. Like many people with a strong ops background feel like, oh no, that's nothing new here. There is nothing new if you already know how to do it. But if you don't know how to do it, then suddenly with Docker it's possible. So that was the huge big thing. Now I think a lot of people, once they got Docker and containers figured out, are like, okay, now how do I get that to run on a cluster on multiple machines? And that's when you need orchestration. So that's the reason why, I mean, from my perspective, while Kubernetes and Swarm and orchestration became the next big thing.
Right. Next question. That was a good one. Because that's the thing about IT, right? Is we're susceptible to hype and also the opposite of hype, which is like people trashing on a thing that's actually very useful and usable. I mean, you know, don't hang out in Y Combinator if you in the news, if you Hacker News, if you're aware of that. If you can find a lot of good stuff there, but you can also find a lot of hype and a lot of hate all at the same time.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of like Reddit. So you have to take everything, I think, in those areas like Hacker News and Reddit and stuff. You have to take it with a grain of salt, because for every person that trashes a thing, there's probably 5 people that love it and depend on it daily, and then for everything that someone hypes on a thing, there's probably 5 people that don't even need it, right? So it's a weird situation where you can't really take any one person's advice, even mine. You can't, because I have my own opinions and my own subjective view of things. So you kind of have to do your own research and try things out yourself and come to your own conclusion, I think.
Yeah, and I think specifically on the matter of Hacker News, there is one thing that, from my perspective, it's pretty dangerous and toxic for newcomers in our community, because there is a lot of people who are going to assert things in a very kind of strong way, like, oh, things are that way because this, and I know because I've done this for a long time. Except we generally don't know what the actual credentials of these people are. Maybe they are the people they say they are. Maybe they are just some rando pretending that they've been running high-frequency trading for 10 years while they actually don't have the latest clue about what they're talking about. And we often see a lot of hostility and specific tone. And when you're new to the community, new to tech, you can end up believing that this is the way that people will talk to each other in the workplace. You can end up being like, okay, I'm seeing people kind of, trashing each other's ideas and having some kind of really strong heated arguments. And apparently that's the way it is. And then kind of bring back to the workplace while these behaviors are actually not okay in the workplace. So I think that's the main gripe I have with this platform, is that there is like the moderators are turning a blind eye on that, on the pretense of like free speech, etc., without realizing that this is setting an extremely bad precedent for our industry. And as a personal rule, I decided to not engage on this platform anymore, because I don't think these are positive forces for our industry, generally speaking.
Yeah, I tend to agree. There can be a lot of toxic talk on there, even, and not even talking about people being mean or hateful or angry towards one another. It's that your opinion. I love. There's another Docker captain that taught me strong opinions loosely held, and I tend to that basically means that what I believe right now, I am passionate about, but I am not going to hold that opinion forever. As new evidence comes in, I will change my opinion, and that's okay. We all learn, we all adapt. The problem with that opinion, and that's how kind of I treat things. And the challenge with that is, like, online, that doesn't present itself very easily, right? So if I'm strongly opinionated in a forum, people take that in a totally different context and way than if we're interacting one-on-one. So if you're someone who's in the community, I would say, honestly, go find any meetups or conferences you can go to. That is the best way to get, I think, the real world heartbeat of like what's going on. Like if you can go to a Kubernetes meetup or a Docker meetup, or a little, I mean, every conference now has container talks. You will see a totally different vibe from people there than you would ever in a forum in like Reddit or Hacker News or anything online, right? Because when you meet people in the real world, it's never black and white. They're never. Nothing's perfect. Nothing is easy as it was on the internet, on blogs. Nothing was as perfect as they had hoped. But people also tend to be much nicer. They're kinder. They listen. They'll share more information. They're willing to take questions, especially if you're a speaker or someone who's in the community leadership area. they're usually really good at that. So I always send people to the real world first, even though we have this great thing on the internet that we can learn from. Also, places like this, like YouTube's, where people are getting out there, they're using their real names, they're sharing their life experience. That's usually a better way to learn than just reading a couple of rants on some random forum of some person you've never heard of saying that something doesn't work or something is crap or whatever. I get that a lot, actually. A lot of students come in and say, I read that this is crap on the internet or that this doesn't work or whatever. And I have to spend a lot of my time saying, well, that's just one person's opinion. And I have to show them all this evidence to convince them otherwise. So it can be a little tough, I think, for learning. On that note, the next question is actually, oops, we already answered that one. Can Kube run without containers, aka like Mesos? No, right?
Okay, so it's, you know, if we kind of take a step back and if we were to play that galaxy brain meme when you're like, oh, in fact, it's more. If we really look at what Kubernetes is from a kind of strict pedantic point of view, it's just a set of APIs. So currently we use these APIs to create, for instance, a deployment, and that deployment ends up creating pods with our applications in them. But nothing would prevent us from creating a new object type that, I don't know, that could be a virtual machine with how many CPUs and what RAM and what disk image you're using, like the kind of objects we have on any kind of public or private cloud, and use the Kubernetes API to manage these VMs. We could. It would be really weird, but technically we could. Now, to have a more practical answer, one thing that I've been looking a lot into recently is something that sometimes we call like nodeless Kubernetes, which is like, so running Kubernetes without nodes. And what that really means is that instead of having a bunch of nodes, and these nodes are kind of there waiting for us to run containers on them, I'm like, I don't have any node. I have my control plane, I have my Kubernetes API, it's running up there. But each time I want to create one of these deployments, which ends up creating pods for my containers, at that point, then I will create something to hold this. So maybe I'm going to use, for instance, like there is Fargate on AWS, and there is ACI on Azure. There are other like container as a service APIs on other cloud providers. So I'm going to use that. Or another approach is something that's done by a product called Kiyot, Kiyot. And that's very interesting because where you start your application, instead of creating a container, it's going to put that app on a VM. And, you know, it's a little bit like having one pod equal one VM. And that way you use up only exactly the amount of resource that you really need. So instead of having all these nodes kind of 80% empty waiting for me to deploy on them, if I'm not running anything, I have 0 node. And as I'm starting containers, then they end up in their own VMs. So I'm not going to tell much more about this because I could speak about it for
talk about it all day.
But it's something that's really interesting to really have kind of on-demand cluster sizing and pricing. And it also brings some simplicity on other fronts. So
yeah. And you wrote about this recently, right? You have a blog post on it? Yeah. So I put that blog post for those in chat in the chat because it was a really interesting. Basically, he goes all through all what he just talked about, but way more detail, and it's really cool. Virtual kubelets, and yeah, it's cool stuff. I remember reading that and thinking, yeah, I have so much to learn. All right, so moving on down the question list because we're going to have to wrap it up here in a few minutes. Is only Docker supported? I think what you're maybe asking about is only Docker as the runtime or the engine supported. No, there's actually other ones. Docker is still the default, right? So
it's kind of the default, but I see that this may change in the future. We can already use many other runtimes. We could use Rocket, we could use Cryo, we could use Containerd, we could use gvisor, we could use a bunch of others. On the field, I still see mostly Docker because there is no significant difference in using another runtime for most people. And that's the whole point of it. It's like the Kubernetes abstracts that. So that's the whole point of it, is that I shouldn't see any difference. But if I have particular constraints, like if I want to add an extra layer of security, or if I want to have like this specific feature of another runtime, then I can switch the engine and use something else. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. If the default one works, just stick with that, unless you have very specific reasons for like container D or something else, right? Someone asked a question, syntax, I think it's how you saying that name. How manageable is a non-managed cluster for a small DevOps team? Because that's like saying, how many things can I fit in my car? Well, what size car? What things are you talking about?
I mean, often when I do training, or when people ask me like, hey, what should I run it myself, or which one should I take, I like making the joke that the best way to deploy and operate Kubernetes is to get somebody else to do it for you. And I really mean it, because especially if you're a small team and you're already stretched thin on a bunch of things, just use one of the managed Kubernetes offerings out there, because most often times you will end up paying mostly for the compute, so the VMs that you would pay for anyway, and then maybe you add a little extra for the control plane. But if you compare to the price you pay for the rest of the cluster, that's really small, and most often times that's really worth it. I know companies who manage their own Kubernetes clusters, either because they are on-prem, or because they have thousands of nodes and they're like, okay, we really need to fine-tune the control plane and everything. So like, yeah, of course, in that case, you want to run your own. But if you have thousands of nodes, you have a pretty big SRE team and ops culture there to make that happen. If you're a small team, really at least start with a managed one to make your life easier. And then maybe at some point, again, if you have some specific use cases or whatever, maybe you want to operate it yourself. But then again, I think if you have the requirement for, I need to host this myself because I'm like aerospace or military or health or whatever, then I would hope that you have more than a tiny ops team to make that happen. So,
yeah, and it's tough too, because syntax, for your question, the most common answer I and everyone I talk to gets as a consultant when we ask people, what are your requirements for an orchestrator? The answer we usually get is, we were told to run Kubernetes, and that's the only requirement. So it's a challenge, because there are so many dependencies. What type of storage are you going to need to use? Does that storage have compatibility for your orchestrator? Is your team actually fluent at like Linux administration, distributed computing, distributed monitoring and logging? Like, those are all things that like you need to know in order to operate your own production cluster of anything. And so there's a lot of things around just analyzing the expertise of the team, the budget, the size of your eventual deployment, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Like, does it need to be multi-OS? Does it need to be Windows and Linux? Like, there's so many things that go into deciding your orchestrator, and then even deciding, once you've chosen an orchestrator, let's assume it's Kubernetes, are you going to do a managed offering, like a cloud managed? Are you going to do an on-prem managed? Docker recently announced this Docker Kubernetes service, and I'm not exactly sure. I don't actually know how to explain it yet. It sounds like a managed service offering, but I'm not really sure if that's what it is. Do you do something like Rancher, where it makes the deployment and setup easier, and it gives you a nice GUI to manage the cluster in addition to the Kubernetes GUI? Or because you're going to be so custom and you have so many specific requirements that you just do everything upstream vanilla and you do it all yourself? Those are all really hard questions to answer, but what I hope we can answer here are the things you need to know and the things you need to ask of yourself when you're deciding. And hopefully some of those things we're talking about helps you. Basically the best thing to do is to go back with a list of questions, and you have a conversation with your management, your budget, your team, your timeline, and that helps guide you towards the answer, because none of this is easy to decide on. No tech product that a company implements is an easy decision. Usually, you usually have lots of factors involved. Um, yeah. So, like, I mean, some factors is sometimes it's just we only deploy open source and it has to be free. That's if that's a requirement, then your choices are shrink. You have lot less fewer options. Um, let's see, but that's a great question. Thanks for asking. And for reference, he was saying comparing it to something like Swarm. Swarm, one person can manage dozens of nodes, no problem, in my opinion. Usually because your security, you have very few options out of the box. So as you're adding layers of features on top of Swarm, that's what adds the complexity, and you have to learn those things individually. Where on Kubernetes, a lot of that just comes out of the box. So to just get started, there's more work to do. There's more things to concern yourself with. Neither design is bad or good. It just depends on how you want to deploy your orchestration. Let's see. How expensive is a kube cluster compared to a Swarm cluster? It seems dramatically more expensive from what I've seen.
On small clusters, I think I would agree, just because the footprint of the control plane is a thing. It exists. Same thing like kubelet, the little agent that runs on every node, has a footprint. That being said, on bigger clusters, that's going to be less of an issue, because that little extra, like if it takes, I'm just going to pull a random number. If you need like 1 gig of RAM and 1 core for the control plane, if you're running on a few nodes with 4 gigs of RAM and a few cores, then it amounts to a significant chunk of your cluster. Now on a much bigger cluster, it doesn't matter much. But yeah, on small clusters, especially when I deliver training, I'm often a little bit eye rolling at how much resource is being used by the API server and etcd and all these things, and the design choices that went into Swarm were deliberate to kind of cut a lot of these layers and have Swarm work on way leaner machines. I don't think that it would be wise to pick one or the other just for that reason. If you want to run on a bunch of Raspberry Pis, for instance, then yeah, maybe you want to look into that and do your own measurements to see like if it's something that matters for you. On bigger clusters and like real world scenarios, I don't think that this should be the determining factor.
Yeah. I agree. I think starting out, there's probably a bigger difference than once you've, because really a lot of this is dependent upon services like etcd on the Kubernetes side and Swarm, which has it built in, but they largely use the same quorum sort of concepts where they need 3 or 5 management nodes that all have the stuff. So once you're into dozens of nodes, then I don't know that there would really be much difference. It would probably be more about all the excess things you need to run on top of that, like the monitoring and the logging and the other stuff that maybe would add more burden. But that's going to be probably the same on both sides. The next question here is, what would you recommend would you recommend tools like Helm and Kustomize?
Yeah, absolutely. So Helm and Kustomize and also a few others it's a little bit like the Compose of the Kubernetes world, except that in the case of Compose, we're super lucky because the Docker motto, like build, ship, and run any app anywhere. Yeah. In the case of Compose, we're doing build and run, but on the same machine, so we don't need to ship. So that's really easy and nice, and Compose gives us this outstanding workflow. In the case of Kubernetes, we can't avoid the ship phase. And so that's why we don't have a perfect tool yet that would kind of do what Compose is doing. What we have is tools like Helm or Kustomize on the deployment side of things. Helm, pretty complex if you want to write your own Helm charts, but really useful if you want to use an existing Helm chart. That's going to be relatively easy. And if you want to deploy Prometheus or a bunch of other things, like Helm will be kind of your package manager for Kubernetes. Like, I want to install that thing, boom, and then manage like versions and upgrades, etc. Writing your own Helm charts, that's trickier, and that's where Customize can help, because it's an easier way to do that. Customize will let you take a bunch of Kubernetes resource YAML, so a little bit like your compose file, if you will, but you need to tweak a few things, because now that you are in the development environment, from dev to staging to prod, you need to change the number of replicas and maybe the resources and maybe like this and that and that. So Customize will let you override a bunch of things in your YAML in a relatively easy way. In particular, if you want to get started with Customize, there is an amazing tool called Replicated Ship, which it gives you a little thing that you start that on your bundle of YAML. It's going to spin up like a web interface, and in that web interface, you're like, okay, I want to change that specific field over here, and it's going to generate the scaffolding for Customize. And so the outcome of that is that after just a few clicks, you get something that you can feed into Customize. A little bit, if you want to transpose that to the Docker world, it's a little bit like something that would help you to make your first Docker file or your first compose file, if you will, just by doing a few clicks. So Replicated Ship, like amazing tool. I really love it. And then I think, remember what I said earlier about this metaphor of like steps, and you climb the steps one by one.
Right.
I think after using Customize for a while, you're like, I wish I could do some more advanced things. Like I would like to have one parameter, one configuration parameter that would have a bunch of like impact and effects in various files, and I don't know how to do that. And that's when you can look into Helm and be like, oh, Helm does all these things, and indeed it has a lot of complexity, but at least I know why I'm paying and for that complexity. It's like, again, if I'm going back to the car metaphor, it's a little bit like learning to drive and picking between driving shift stick or manual. Maybe it's automatic or manual. It's great if you start with automatic, and then later maybe you're like, okay, if I pick manual transmission, this is what I get for this extra investment. It's not a great example because so many people learn manual transmission first anyway, and they're fine. Right. But it's a kind of like I have these two options. I'm going to start with the easy one, so that's easy and I get stuff done. And I know I still have this more complex option, and actually maybe I will end up looking into that, and maybe that's going to be in 6 months, and maybe that's going to be in 6 hours, because I'm going to like hit a wall with a simple option. But for Kubernetes and also many other scenarios in general, I advise people to start with the easy option if it looks like it might work, because if it does, you save yourself a lot of trouble. Right. And if it doesn't, then you still have picked up something useful along the way. And generally, you don't waste much time along the way, because starting with the more complex option first it's going to be like more things to juggle with and reason with. So starting with the easy option is often a good step on the way to the more complex option.
Yeah, for sure. A couple of quick hit questions. One, oh shoot, where'd it go? Scott asks, he was talking about Swarm and says Swarm isn't available everywhere. Swarm is available everywhere Docker-D can be installed. So if you have Docker Engine on a machine, if you just install Docker, anything in the last 3 years, it has Swarm built in. All you do is Docker Swarm init, and that's a Swarm, a single machine Swarm cluster. So you can install on Raspberry Pis, on ARM, on mainframes, on Windows, Linux, Mac, anything. There's options for all of those. Every Linux distribution will support it that I've seen. Some might be a little more effort than others because you have to add in a repo, an apt-get repo or a yum repo to get the modern versions. But yeah, it's all there. The next question was, and this is a really good one, I think it's going to be an easy answer, is if I wanted to develop for, let's see if I can find it. Now I can't find the question, but it was, Snat asked, is there a specific way of developing a web or distributed app or tips and tricks that we can get more out of Docker or Kubernetes. And I think what they're asking is, do I need to design my app, or how would I design my app if I wanted to make it work on orchestration easily?
That's a great question. I think the first answer would be to look into the 12-factor app design principles, because a lot of them are going to go nicely into the cloud native landscape, etc. So it's a lot of things about do not hard code configuration values in your thing, like try to use the environment or separate configuration file, which for a lot of us, that's going to be like obvious things that we learned sometimes the hard way. But now we're like, okay, when we design stuff, we separate configuration, we think about state, like being aware that this app might be scaled on multiple machines. So if I'm asking people to upload files, images or videos or whatnot, if I'm just storing that on the local file system, that's not going to be replicated. So I have to think about that. I have to think about maybe I want to use an object store like S3 or something like that. And so all these things that for many of us, we already started to kind of apply that and keep that in mind when developing for the cloud, generally speaking. These things still hold for containerized applications. I can't really think of many container-specific advice. Very often, honestly, it makes things much easier. Because we have this really nice DNS-based discovery, and so many other things like the ambassador pattern, and now like service meshes, which means that we can very often decouple not only load balancing and discovery, but also gathering metrics and observability on our services. We don't need to enmesh together like the calls I'm making to the API and also timing these calls to gather metrics. I can decouple these things, and that's really powerful. So I would say if you want extensive readings on what can I do to make sure my apps will behave nicely in containers, check out 12-factor apps, just because it's been around for a long time. So there is like tons of material available on it on all levels, like for beginner all the way up to advanced programmers. So I would say look at that, and that will get you really close to the cloud native best practices, so to speak.
Yeah. So a lot of people are talking about Kubernetes training and mentioning some courses. So I thought it would be appropriate for us to wrap this up, because we're not going to be able to get through all the rest of the questions. I will try to answer all of them in chat, so stick around. If you're not able to get if your question wasn't answered, I'm going to be sticking around in chat. So raise your hand in chat if you're still there and you want to repeat your question if you didn't, if you think we skipped it or whatever, because we had so many great questions, and we're definitely going to do this again someday soon, because there's a lot to talk about. And the thing that Jérôme and I want to announce today is that we've been hinting at for quite some time that we're working on a Kubernetes course together. So later this year, expect to hear some news from us on a Kubernetes course we're going to be launching based on his workshop that he's been developing hundreds and hundreds of slides for over the last few years, as well as all of our teaching in the real world and working with these tools online. And Jérôme's awesome. I love hanging out with him and learning stuff. And I thought, what better way to do a Kubernetes course, because there's already so many Kubernetes things out there, than to actually bring in like one of the original Docker DevOps people and someone who's just knee deep in Kubernetes stuff every day. And take my Swarm mindset, my Swarm hat, and his Kubernetes hat. We come together and we teach what I hope to be one of the best ways to learn Kubernetes out there. And we're going to be releasing some videos here eventually in the next couple of months that are some updates and some sort of trickled content a little bit. And then we're going to announce later on this year some big things. So stick around for that. Of course, if you have to learn Kubernetes today, one of the ways you can learn that, and I'll put this link into chat, is Jérôme has a great website that shows all of his workshops that he's doing that are public. It's called container.training. So I put that into chat. I've been helping with him on that for years. It's actually 3 major courses, one on Docker 101, one on Swarm, and then one on Kubernetes. And there's so many slides now. I think it's actually thousands of slides, right? Like over
close to
2,000 slides.
1,000. Yeah, if we combine.
If you add all three courses together,
yeah,
yeah, because I think it's like 4 or 5. It's like 500 or 600 on Swarm. I think it's like that many or more on Docker 101. Yeah, and you've got a lot on Kubernetes. So that's all open source content, and you can find past workshops he's done there, as well as the open source slides from it. And there's a lot going on in there, so definitely check that out. Of course, it's not presented. None of that stuff is really presented in a instructor online curriculum type thing like you're used to on my Udemy courses. So that's what we're working on together, is to put that all together into a modular approach where you're learning with nice little short videos, and it's all together with assignments. And so that's going to be a lot of fun for us to start talking about. And we'll be talking more about that here as the year goes on and we get more and more into that content. So, Jérôme, is there anything else that you wanted to mention about learning Kubernetes that we didn't get to? I feel like we covered a ton.
No, like I'm really excited to combine the in-person work I've been doing for the last year and so with the expertise that you have, as you said, like building a palatable small segments, an actual online course actually.
Yeah.
So combining like those two things together, like I'm excited to work together on that.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun, and of course we're never in the same place at the same time, except for once every 3 years. Even though we're both traveling to conferences all the time and talking, we occasionally, I think it was a year ago, I think we were at a conference in New York for one day together, and we recorded a video, which I think is actually in the intro to this video. There's a little clip of it, but it never actually made it on the internet. So. Maybe we should put that out when we have a minute. But we're definitely going to be putting out more stuff together as we get closer to the release of this stuff. And I'm glad that everyone's excited to learn Kubernetes. If you're already learning Kubernetes, thank you so much for sharing your learning stuff in the chat, because there's people today that are actively learning Kubernetes with other courses. But we're, of course, going to be out there soon. So thanks again for joining. You can find Jérôme, by the way, on the internet, on Twitter.
Yeah.
I'm going to post his Twitter link so you can reach out to Jérôme, follow him on Twitter. He's on there way more than I am, talking every day to people, helping them out. And he also does some really cool stuff with music. You can check out some of his stuff on there as well. So thanks again for joining, Jérôme. What's next for you? What's now that PyCon's over, what's the next big thing you're going to be?
What's the next big thing? I'm going to be presenting a 2-day advanced Kubernetes tutorial at the Velocity conference in San Jose. That will be roughly mid-June. It's almost sold out. Well, in fact, it was sold out, and then we decided to increase the capacity. So I expect that it's going to be sold out again. After that, I will be in Montreal, and then in Paris, and then in Europe for a while. But yeah, next big thing is the San Jose Velocity conference.
Cool. Velocity in California. That's actually, I've been there before. That's a really great conference. Right near Silicon Valley, so it always gets a lot of the really smart Silicon Valley tech people there that they ask good questions. I learned there that they have good questions. I learn things from the audience when they ask questions that I don't have the answers to. So great. Well, have fun at that conference. Thanks so much for being online with us. And for those of you watching, thanks for sticking with us. I will stay around and chat to try to answer more of your questions after this. And we'll be back here. I will be back here next Thursday. I don't even know who the guest is going to be yet, but we may have one, we may not. So stay tuned. You have to like and subscribe to this channel to get notifications on that. And then you'll see in the details, we have a newsletter that I send out when things like this show happen. And you'll get notifications about new content, new Docker stuff that I'm always talking about, and more coupons to my courses. So thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you next week on the internet.